Great, thank you so much, Kirsten. So our first question, we're wondering, what has been the role of digital advocacy, for example, through social media platforms or hashtags, et cetera, in racial justice movements, especially in the Black Lives Matter movement, and ongoing national conversations surrounding race and police brutality? Professor Freelon, this is directly your area of expertise, and we'd also love to hear what Sierra you have to think also. So Professor Freelon, go ahead.
There we go. Literally 1 second. Okay, so the role of hashtag activism, racial justice. Well, I can talk your ear off about that. It's been something I've been studying for a long time. And by that, I mean like 5-6 years, which of course the internet time is like centuries. So, I am one who really believes that, digital activism has really played a critical role in elevating not only racial justice concerns, but also other types of issues as well. And so in some ways, I only say that to simply say that like this is not something that the effect of digital activism is not something that is exclusive to racial justice concerns, although I do think that it has seen some of its greatest impacts in the area of racial justice, namely in Black Lives Matter, Say Her Name, and other sort of offshoot movements that have sort of emerged from the digital sphere. Now, if you want to sort of think back to where you were in 2014, I was a professor at a different university, y'all probably in high school, something like that. It was, police brutality specifically was not something that the media was spending a whole lot of time talking about. Now, I'm old enough to remember, the 1992 LA riots, right? So this was after the beating, unfortunately not the death of Rodney King and the acquittal of 4 police officers that were engaged in that. That was something that was real big in the news for, it felt like a few weeks or maybe a couple of months. And then it kind of went away, and there have been other sort of kind of flashpoint incidents after that. You think about Amadou Diallo in 1999, Sean Bell in 2003, and Oscar Grant in 2009. Trayvon Martin 2012. That's 2 years before BLM really starts to sort of attract a lot of mainstream attention. And so what I see is the fact that a largely digital movement, in cooperation with a whole lot of street protests, was really able to transition this issue of police brutality, especially against Black people, African American people, from sort of an occasional story that the media kind of talks about a little bit and then kind of goes away, to one of the media's sort of recurring issue on the media agenda. Now, there's only a very small number of these. A lot of things kind of flashpoint, every once in a while, but the ability to, or the accomplishment rather, of being able to transition an issue like that in a grassroots way from kind of an occasional issue to an ongoing issue that is covered with more frequency, I think is a huge achievement, and one that really could not have been done without the digital component of the activism, which of course works in concert with the offline component as well. So that's just like a really quick summary of that. I can get into the details if folks have follow-up questions.
Thank you so much. Sierra, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And I also would like to just add that I think it's very interesting the way in which organizers have been using social media. On the one hand, we're seeing the proliferation of hashtags and things, but on the other hand, we know that large social media companies like Facebook and Twitter and Amazon and Google have relationships with the police forces in the United States. And so this provides kind of a conundrum where on the one hand, it's a really powerful tool for organizing, but on the other, there is lots of risk of surveillance. So organizers are definitely having to navigate that in this moment, and something that they'll be thinking about for the future to come.
Awesome. So I think in a related note, our next question is about surveillance technologies. And so recently several major tech companies, so Amazon, IBM, Microsoft, recently announced that they would end or pause the sale of their facial recognition technologies to police departments. So what are the dangers of these types of facial recognition and surveillance technologies, especially when used in public-private partnerships? And are facial recognition software too widespread to be even effectively banned? So Sierra, I think you have done a lot of research related to public-private partnerships. So I'm wondering if you want to start off.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, I guess there are several issues at play in the facial recognition debate. And the main ones for me surround accuracy, privacy, and democracy. So if we can think probably of the first issue that everyone or nearly everyone will agree with is that the tools just really aren't accurate right now, especially for individuals with darker skin tones and women. And obviously that maps onto various racial and gender categorizations in our society where it disparately impacts some members of our society more than others. And this is largely because there are several tools being trained on data that is that has underrepresented minorities, not being represented in the data sets. And also at the same time, the tools are being used in Black and brown communities. And so on the one hand, it's very inaccurate at recognizing Black and brown faces, but then on the other side, it's being used predominantly in these communities. So you have lots of harm happening there. This is leading to a really high false positive rate. And there have been some attempts to mitigate this issue by training algorithms on other kinds of data, specifically like police mugshot databases. But this data also is really flawed because it relies on histories of racialization and criminalization. So essentially, in order to have a mugshot, you don't have to be you don't have to be convicted of a crime. You simply have to be arrested. So that means that Black and brown people who are over-policed in their communities end up being overrepresented in this arrest data as well. So this just leads to a number of different issues regarding the accuracy of these technological tools. In order to get around some of these issues, people have tried to create a comprehensive data set of everyone. So companies like Clearview AI are starting to scrape social media accounts with the goal of capturing everyone's face ever. And this naturally leads to a second problem, which is like fundamental privacy concerns. People don't really knowingly consent to the collection and use of this information, especially not for police forces. And at an even higher level, many people just haven't consented to being watched at every point in the street. Unfortunately, lots of our federal laws have lagged far behind these technologies. So the conception of privacy is often vague, and it relies on having property, essentially. The law recommends that privacy should be expected where someone could not reasonably be considered to be in public, which obviously is a very subjective designation, but we can talk more about that later in the Q&A. But lastly, some states have begun to start doing some legislation that provides stricter protections from these. But these bans on facial recognition that we see lead to kind of the third major issue, especially with the public-private partnership, which is that these are usually not democratically regulated. Most of these are not ballot issues. They're usually top-down from city governments. And because of that, there are lots of stipulations. Many of the states have clauses that recommend that police use of surveillance is something that will still be allowable, even if private surveillance is not allowable, especially within the facial recognition debate. So it just provides a lot of issues wherein companies are able to collaborate with states. And because of things like trade secrets, they don't have to actually share a lot of their information with the people who would necessarily be interested in advocating against them. But the people don't even really often have the chance to do so except in protest format. So there's lots of different issues surrounding the facial recognition debate that provides lots of dangers, not only to Black and brown folks, but also to the wider society.
Cool. Professor Freeland, do you have anything that you want to add?
Sure, yeah. I mean, when I look at an issue like this, my general frame on it is to sort of divide it into two areas of inquiry. One is kind of empirical or fact-based, and that deals with things like accuracy rates in terms of classifying people of certain, skin tones and what have you. And then the second piece is the normative piece. So that question is, irrespective of the accuracy and the empirical aspect, should we be doing this at all? And so to me, those are very separate issues. And so when I think about the empirical side of it, I tend to think, okay, well, if it's not accurate now, then at least in theory, it could be made more accurate through better training data or more incorporation of, Black and brown faces in the training data that you're using and feeding into this. And so that to me is almost kind of like a matter of time. Technology is going to improve, it's going to get better. And so I sort of treat that as almost kind of inevitable. Now, the normative piece, I think, is the piece that is addressed best by, or that can't really be addressed through purely technical means. And so that's addressed by people talking among themselves in a democracy, deciding their like level of surveillance that they really want to have, you know, deciding or trying to figure out whether there are certain communities that are disproportionately affected by this. Short answer, yes. And what to do about that. And so when you think about it from a legal perspective, again, not a lawyer, but if you compare this to trying to legislate something like online harassment, which is like in many cases, hard to stamp out because there's not a centralized entity that's doing it in many cases. This is something where, a municipality with a stroke of a pen could, at least in theory, make a lot of very bad things illegal, which is what you want. So for me, I look at this as an organizing opportunity for people who are really concerned with this, for people who live in communities where police or other authorities are using this, right? Like, laws can be changed and it can be more transparent or it can be outlawed outright. And this is an area where I think law has a really strong role to play as opposed to other areas in which law is less strong just because of the nature of the technology.
Thank you both for these insights. So let's transition now a little bit from the technology itself towards the people behind the technology. We've been talking about major tech companies, and recently we've seen growing controversy surrounding their role in supporting racial inequality and injustice more broadly. Just last week, a congressional committee presented evidence that strongly suggested that Facebook, Google, Amazon, and Apple engaged in predatory market behavior. And we've also very recently seen in the news Facebook engineers announcing their resignations due to Facebook's, quote, continued refusal to act on the president's bigoted messages aimed at radicalizing the American public, of course, referring to the president's social media post that when the looting starts, the shooting starts. So, speaking from a more personal moral level, as, many of us here are students and technologists and will likely encounter this kind of dilemma, how do you reconcile working under potentially racist institutions when you don't necessarily agree with some of their actions, but nonetheless, that's not the entire story, right? Is making change from inside the system by, for example, working for a big tech company a possibility? Or is that, somewhat more, is that something along the lines of being complicit in injustice? Or even, speaking more on the university level, I know from personal experience, the Yale Police Department, it has a really contentious relationship with the largely Black and brown communities of New Haven. And, yet Yale continues to support the Yale Police Department. And so then what is the role of students and staff and faculty at such an institution? Sierra, you've worked for Facebook and you've done really, really great research on meaningful regulation of big tech. Love to hear your thoughts, and Professor Freelands.
Yeah, I can start on this one. So I did work at Facebook for a few years, and there I encountered some people who were at the forefront of trying to protect rights online. They were generally good people, and they wanted the best for all users. And so I guess the way that I would answer this question is that every movement needs boots on the ground everywhere. There's no way that you can make change only from one place. The civil rights movement, for example, would not have been successful unless we had the active marches and boycotts and the legislative attacks in courts, which was one of the systems that upheld white supremacy for quite some time, and also people integrating white schools, for example. So many of these institutions that we think uphold negative systems often need to be infiltrated and changed both from the inside and without. The key is pressure, however. So the people on the inside need to be clear about their moral objectives and need to push for change. So we have to advocate for change in numerous places, both inside companies and outside of them. And I think it's really important to frame the goal as something that's not antagonistic. The goal is not something, we're not trying to adopt an us versus them mentality or really to tear big tech to the ground. I think the goal is really to bring everyone closer together and convince everyone that it's in their best interest to protect the most vulnerable. It's in their best interest to work towards justice and to advocate for change. And so through my experiences at Facebook, I met a lot of people who were trying to do really, really good work and often had trouble doing so just because of the massive scale of the question. So one really good example of this is I worked on a legal protective team where one of the main issues was how do we protect people from hate speech online? How do we make sure that no one denies the Holocaust in all of Facebook's users? Facebook has 1.7 billion daily active users. So how do you regulate that sort of speech? For me, these are design problems, and the only way to solve them is to have technologists in conversations with historians, in conversations with social scientists, which inevitably come from all over. And importantly, we also need to engage the community on this as well, because they have very specific insights about how these things affect them. So that being said, in order to truly radically change the system, I really think that we have to have a radical imagination. We have to imagine the kind of world that we want to live in and then work towards achieving it, both inside and outside of companies.
Okay, I guess I'm next. You know, my approach to this, I think, is pretty similar to Sierra's. I don't think it's an either or proposition. I think you've got to work all angles that are available to you. Specifically on the question of working with big tech companies, this is something that I am currently engaged in. So I'm doing research that will make use of data that's provided directly by these companies. And in some cases, managed directly by them because their terms of service don't allow external researchers to actually touch the data. So in other words, I have to tell somebody like what analysis I want run, and then they run it. So, you know, the approach that I've taken, so I did a couple of things before I engaged in this project. The first thing I did was I asked a bunch of questions. I said, well, you know, is Facebook going to have veto power over the results of this research project if it doesn't make them look good? You know, what assurances do I have of the independence of the principal investigator, namely me, and so on and so forth, questions along those lines. And I said also, you know, you need to, and this was the question I told the people that asked me to do this. I said, look, you know, I reserve the right to pull out if I feel that things aren't going in a direction that is leading toward research that is independent of external meddling. And I said, you know, I reserve the right to make that judgment on my own. So just, you know, that's a condition to be signing up for this. So, you know, and I would generalize that to say, you know, if you're working with any organization, whether it's big tech or any other large institution, I mean, I think it's worth doing a bit of advanced thinking about the kinds of things that would make you sort of disengage. You say, okay, this is so egregious, so problematic, or I've tried to really push for change within to an extent that I feel like I can't do it anymore, and I feel like nobody's listening, and I feel like struggling within the system is no longer worth it for me. And so doing some advanced thinking about that before you get to that point, I think will help save a lot of frustration, and will help you to, or help whoever does this, whoever finds himself in this position, to redirect their energies more appropriately.
Yeah, I think on a related note, as we're talking about like pressure internally and externally for large tech companies, like another important aspect is also within tech companies ensuring that there's diversity and inclusion in hiring and the work environment. So wondering how can tech companies apply like anti-racist and anti-discriminatory practices to their workplaces? And is it enough to have diversity in the people behind the technology, and like what further steps I guess would need to be taken? Professor Freeland, do you want to start?
Sure. So, you know, never having done hiring at a tech company, it's a little bit, you know, it's hard for me to speak to this, but I have been on a number of hiring committees, you know, in the departments in the higher education institutions that I've been affiliated with. And I think the most important thing when you have an underrepresented group, actually, I was talking to somebody last week who's trying to become the president of my discipline's largest, you know, sort of trade association, as it were. And one of the things I suggested to him is I said, look, you want to think about goals, right? So if you have a group that is underrepresented in your association, the goal is to transition them from underrepresentation to representation, right? So you need to do a couple of things. The first thing you need to do is you need to figure out some steps that you can take to be able to increase representation. This is like super high abstract, and I'll take that in a second. So first, figure out what you're going to do to increase representation. The second thing you need to do is you need to figure out how to measure whether or not those steps have been effective, right? So what I suggested is I said, so we have an annual meeting. So I said, okay, all right, every year, let's try to figure out whether representation is actually increasing and whether or not it's logical for us to infer that it was the steps that we took that actually led to that. And let's try to figure out what our goals are. So are we talking about, representation in an organization that's proportional to population representation, or what, right? So let's set some goals, see if we can meet them, and then also figure out whether, if the steps we're taking are effective or not. And if they're not, let's figure out how to do some other things that are effective, that will increase those numbers to get them to where they need to go. And just to bring this back to the tech industry really quickly, then I'll shut up, is the idea that you need to figure out where the problem is, right? So is it the problem, for example? So one potential problem is there's a lot of, black, brown, whatever your BIPOC, group of people that you're trying to increase representation of. Like, if the problem is there's a lot of people coming out of institutions with these degrees and not getting hired at the hiring point, that's one problem. Another problem is there's just not enough people getting the degrees and they're not applying because they don't have the degrees. And that's a pipeline problem that you got to deal with that at the higher education stage. So doing some research to try to figure out where the problem actually exists, I think, is absolutely critical to solving this. I don't know the answer to this. I haven't done the research, but it seems to me that you cannot increase the representation and do the kinds of things we're talking about without figuring out what the source of the problem is and directing your efforts toward addressing it at that source, or sources, not necessarily just one thing.
Yeah, I'm a little less optimistic about how well representation works as the end-all be-all solution to some of the issues in big tech. First, I think, well, having worked in tech, I know that the numbers of non-white individuals who work in big tech are just abysmal. I think the most recent numbers is like the top 5 companies have under 5% Black employees, which is ridiculous. But that being said, I think that simply increasing the number of Black and brown people who work at these companies won't necessarily solve all of the problems that we have. For me, it's just the idea that just because you're a racialized person in the United States does not necessarily mean that you're invested and committed to movements for liberation. Certainly they can be correlated, but I don't think that one necessarily causes the other. So I think on top of understanding, as Dr. Freeland mentioned, where the problem lies and getting more people into these companies, we really have to think critically about the production of these technological tools, the impact of these technological tools on various communities. And this goes beyond just simply putting people in places. This also looks at where people are placed in certain hierarchies of power within a company. Simply having tons of people working on the business side of Facebook or Google won't necessarily change much happening at the C-suite level. The decisions happening in the CEO level, the COO level, these things are really important. And if we've got a really high percentage of Black and brown folks at the company, but none of them are making integral decisions, then I'm not necessarily sure that it'll change much. So just some things to keep in mind as we talk about the role of diversity and inclusion. Certainly we need to include more people in these conversations, but also there's other work that needs to be done beyond that. It's really just a first step.
Thank you both so much for these insights. As a kind of concluding question, we've gone over some of the really pressing, really public and pertinent issues at the intersection of racial justice and technology. We're going to soon move on to audience questions. So if you're a part of the audience, feel free to go into the chat and post some questions. And as like one final question before we move on to that, what issues do you think at the intersection of racial justice and technology are lesser known and deserve more attention that people don't usually think about? Sierra, would you like to start?
Sure. One thing that's really exciting for me is this long history of protest and activism surrounding tech and necessarily racism in tech and technological tools. These critiques are certainly not new. There's a very long history that's actually really quite exciting and gives me hope, at least. One of the earliest examples of this actually came in 1971, like well before lots of artificial intelligence, well before lots of facial recognition, when a group called Computer People for the Peace actually argued that IBM was enacting quote unquote corporate racism. So this is really interesting to me. And even before this, a scholar of surveillance and sociology, Simone Brown, has this incredibly detailed long history about the forms of resistance that come from people being surveilled, which she calls dark surveillance. And this goes all the way back to the transatlantic slave trade for her. So understanding that this critique is actually situated in a much larger history gives me a lot of hope, because it shows that we're not alone in our fights and we're actually standing on the shoulders of giants. So we're much further along than we think we are, and we just need to keep pushing. So that's one thing that I'm really interested in.
Yeah, so for me, there are a lot of these. The one that jumped into my mind first, I think is, I think a lot of people think of algorithmic, bias when they do think about it, in terms of, what you might see in your Google search results or different websites trying to infer different things about you and showing you different results based on who the sites think that you are, or to the extent that a site can think. But, I read an article a couple of years ago about certain types of algorithmic bias that only affect certain kinds of people. So a good example of this would be an algorithm that attempts to predict recidivism rates when it comes to parole board hearings and trying to decide whether folks should be, let out of prison. And, there are private companies that sell this software, and due to trade secrets and, things of this nature, they don't show their work. And so basically you have this black box where decisions are coming out of, and there's no accountability for this. And so this is something that's a little bit hidden because it only affects people who have, gotten caught up in the legal system. But it's something that I think is hugely important as it begins to infiltrate other areas, such as making decisions about credit scores, health insurance, and the rest of it. And you've got an algorithm making these decisions, and there's no accountability. And the companies that make it can hide behind, trade secrets and intellectual property to prevent such accountability from emerging.
Great, thank you so much. Really awesome insights. So we have a couple of questions coming into the chat. So this first question is for Professor Freeland by Xiaoli. She came across the Twitter network analysis that you did on your GitHub and found it so interesting. Could you talk a bit more about your study, and also in general, what are the new technical tools we can leverage to analyze interpersonal relationships across racial and ethnic groups?
Well, I've done more than one network analysis, so I'm not sure exactly which one you're talking about. But generally speaking, I can talk about the utility of network analysis when it comes to this kind of work. I think if you look at something like the Beyond the Hashtags report that came out in 2016, I think that may have been circulated along with some of the intro materials for this session. I think one of the things it does is it helps to highlight the individuals and organizations and institutions that who are receiving most attention in the social media network, the ones to whom most people are paying attention, and the ones that are really setting the agenda for the media as well as for politicians. And it also helps to look, if you look at it over time, as we did in that report, try to figure out when new individuals and organizations start popping up in the conversation, some of whom may support the movement, some of whom may not, and trying to figure out what kind of impact they're having in the conversation, whether it's advancing the cause, whether it's trying to sort of hold it back or trying to stop it. And so, no, I think these kinds of analyses are very important. That's why I do them. A while, around June and July, when a lot of the protests were really heating up, I was talking to my wife, and she said, "Oh, you should do another Beyond the Hashtags." And I said, "Hon, that took me 9 months. By the time I'm done with this, it'll be sort of old news." But that's I think that in some ways the plight of the researcher, to be able to do it right and effectively. It takes time, right? It's not just something you snap your fingers and make it happen. If you want rigorous work, you got to wait for it. So, and I may do that. I've got other projects that are in the hopper, as it were, but. I do think that kind of work is really important. It is at least conceptually important to update that and to take a look at what's going on now in relationship to things that happened before. And that's sort of general thing. Yeah.
Yeah. So our next question is from Kristen. So activism has a new face these days. Protest takes place online, via technology, and on the streets. So do either of you have any thoughts either for or against social media activism / resource sharing? And I'll tag on to this also, like protecting against misinformation as well, because I know both of you have done that. And I know, Professor Freeland, you might have to hop off soon, so feel free to do that whenever you need to go. But how about we start with you, Professor Freeland, then, if you have any thoughts.
Okay, so thoughts about resource sharing via social media. I mean, I think it's a good thing. You know, I think that sharing resources is really important and useful. And, you know, prior to social media, sharing resources was something that typically was done either through interpersonal activist networks, you know, through literally snail mailing people various documents of this nature. You know, there were also, you know, sort of small circulation magazines, pamphlets, newsletters, these sorts of things. But, you know, you can really only get so far with that kind of thing. So being able to reach new people that you didn't necessarily know were out there is something that social media is really good at. Of course, the flip side of that is you also tend to attract folks that are trying to work against you. And so, you know, I think the challenge for activists is to try to figure out what kinds of resource sharing and what kinds of generally what kinds of activist activities are best, you know, executed in public, and which are best sort of done behind closed doors digitally. You know, when the threat of harassment is so high that you really want to keep that under wraps and make sure that folks are not causing problems for you while you're trying to get your work done. So, you know, I think that the activists that I know about and that I'm aware of have done a pretty good job of that. And I think that you know, as people realize what's going to attract the trolls, they tend to adapt their you know, tactics accordingly. So generally, I think it is good. I don't think it's an all, you know, purpose kind of thing. I don't think it's really something that you know, is going to fit necessarily all purposes. But you know, I think that there are certain use cases that sort of public sharing does have for it. Yeah.
Great. Sierra, do you have any thoughts?
Oh yeah, so I was going to say, Sierra, do you have anything you want to add, if at all?
I don't think so. I think Dr. Freeland really gave the exact answer that I could have given, even better probably. So.
Wonderful. So our next question is from Connor for both. How do we resolve the tension between matters of privacy and ensuring that machine learning technology and other forms of AI trained using data do not disparately impact minority groups, potentially just solidifying already existing biases? Do we need a human-based audit system? Should we limit what we allow algorithms to do? What do you guys think the solution is?
I'm happy to sort of jump in on this one. I think I might be able to stay like a couple minutes after 5:45, so I'll try to do that. I think what really is necessary is rigorous testing with a diverse set of interests and concerns that come up during the planning and the execution of the testing. So this is one of these areas where I think that representation at tech companies is extremely important, especially in the technical areas, right? So like, it may not occur to a room full of white people, right, that like, oh, hey, like this really works great for like white people. It doesn't work so great for people with different skin tones, right? I mean, that's just not the kind of thing that's going to occur to, you know, a lot of white people. So if you've got people of varying experiences, varying, you know, or, you know, same thing with gender, right? Like, I mean, that could be how is such going to impact women who we know are a disproportionate risk of harassment, cyberstalking, that sort of thing. So I think that having those a wide scope of interest being represented when it comes to this kind of testing will help to broaden the set of concerns that are brought to bear on whatever it is that you are attempting to test. And critically, I think it's really, really important to have almost kind of like a threshold point where you know, somebody is able to at least introduce the idea that the costs or problems with the technology outweigh the potential benefits, right? So that needs to be something that is submitted and discussed seriously to say, look, you know, all this potential for terribleness or things that have already happened really recommend that we should either table this or completely discontinue it from use. So, and that I think is why you need that diversity of perspectives that are in the room when it comes to that testing and at the decision level, as Sierra mentioned, to be able to make the decision that, look, you know, this could be really lucrative, but the disparate impacts of this are really not acceptable, so we're just not going to do it. So, but you know, you're not going to get that with a homogeneous, a homogeneous group of folks that are making those decisions.
Yeah, definitely. I completely agree with that. And I just want to add that we should start from the premise that all technologies will always have politics. They will always be informed by our social world, and even determining where that threshold for what is considered acceptable use of a technology, weighing the risks and the benefits of the technology, that is a normative stance that will not be proven by any empirical study. So taking that as a concern that we need to take seriously, I think there are a couple other things that we can also do to make sure that some of these technologies are regulated properly. One of the first builds on Dr. Freeland's point, and that is holding moratoriums for things that are just not working properly in our society. So this has actually happened a lot in the biological sciences before. For example, CRISPR, there was a moratorium on the use of CRISPR until we could figure out exactly what was going on with it. And that actually worked incredibly well. All scientists got together and they decided that they weren't going to work with the technology anymore until we could determine a moral level of the use of that technology. And from that, we got a lot of different restrictions on the use of the technology, including things like not creating designer babies or only doing it for the good of the society. So that's one thing that we can certainly do. And then the other thing is making sure that regulation doesn't actually happen by the companies that are creating these technologies. Right now, regulation for Facebook, for example, happens within Facebook. Regulation for Google's tools happens within Google's, and there's a team of ethicists at Google who think about whether or not this facial recognition technology is fair or not. I think this is a serious flaw, and I think the reason for that is pretty apparent. And it's essentially just that the people who are creating these technologies have a vested interest in using them, mostly because they're profitable. So one of the main things that we can do is create an external review board. This has started to develop, but once again, there's a Facebook external review board, but Facebook appoints people to that review board. It's not really an external review board. So there are lots of different ways that we can structure that, but definitely external review board and a moratorium to think through some of the pros and cons of these kinds of technologies.
Thank you. Awesome. As another question, feel free to post also, by the way, everybody. I think kind of relevant to what you were talking about, Sierra. Should there be different standards for companies based on whether it's their resources or the scope of the impact of their technologies? For example, if say we weren't talking about Facebook, we were talking about like a tiny little startup that has very little resources, very little staffing, should they be held to the same standard as a larger tech company on having an external review board, or even just maintaining diversity within their staff? What do you think?
Absolutely, yes. They should be held to the same standard. If we think about Facebook, Amazon, Google, these all started in dorm rooms, in small little like shipping centers. These were all once small companies themselves. And if we think about what might have happened if Facebook, Google, Amazon were required to have an external review board at their very infancy, I think we can imagine a completely different future for what it would have looked like right now. I also want to just point out that while big tech likes to occupy a lot of our public discourse, they're not the only companies that are working within this space. And actually, within policing technologies, they don't provide the vast majority of technologies to police forces. They're usually smaller companies that we've never heard of before that fly completely under the radar, and things that we will never be able to hold accountable. One, because we're focused on Facebook, Amazon, and Google, and two, because we kind of think that smaller companies shouldn't be held to stricter standards. So I certainly think that smaller companies, especially startups, need to indoctrinate their workers with this ideology, this conception of justice and fairness from the very beginning. And it's not something that should just be tacked on once a company is multinational. It's something that should be embedded in the practice of creating technologies from the very beginning.
Awesome. Professor Freeland, do you have any additional thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I think that, being small shouldn't be shouldn't be used as an excuse for, not engaging with these issues. I do think that it's probably possible to kind of scale down your expectations for what how to engage. In other words, I don't think you should need like the same level of like review board for like a huge multinational as you should for like a smaller company. But I think that the scale of the intervention should be basically keyed to the size and the scope of the company's behaviors and what they're working on. So, I mean, I think that there are ways to make it acceptable within, the company's, however much money it costs to do this or what have you. But I think it's really important to think about this as part of the cost of doing business in 2020 and beyond, because that's, I think I hope we're rapidly moving in a direction as a society that racial and economic justice and other forms of justice are not like optional. If you want to do it, that's great. If not, that's fine too. But rather essential. And so I think that to the extent that that's true, we should certainly hold our tech companies and other companies as well, other institutions, to a standard that that really puts that belief into practice.
Yeah, I think those are all the questions that we have so far. Maybe one final question we could have for both of our speakers, which I think, Sarah, you've already briefly mentioned, but what is something that kind of gives you hope in this field? If Professor Freeland, you want to start?
There was another question in the chat, just real quickly.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Here, I'll read it out.
I'm happy to answer this one first. Just want to make sure that was still on the radar. So something gives me hope. Yeah, I don't know. I think honestly, the protests this year. Honestly, I hadn't really heard a lot from Black Lives Matter prior to, I guess, May, and so I was wondering, kind of like, does it still have momentum? Are people still paying attention? Are there behind the scenes things going on that I don't necessarily know about? And so to sort of see it reemerge the way that it has, I think has really given me a lot of hope. Just in my neighborhood, seeing a lot of Black Lives Matter signs and seeing folks at the protests and things like that has been really great. Knowing that digital media played a big role in terms of spreading the word about that, getting people out there. So that's been a big one for me, and hopefully that will continue.
Yeah, in the interest of time, we can maybe jump to the last question to talk about that. I think it's an important one.
Yeah, so our final question that popped up in the chat was, the influx of tech companies has become a major driver of gentrification, displacing people of color in several cities, with San Francisco being the most obvious example. So what the tech sector calls success is often devastating to communities of color. So how do we resolve this tension?
I can jump in first here. I'm reminded of the quote from Margaret Atwood that within every utopia, there's a little dystopia. So it's somebody else's dystopia, which for me is the Silicon Valley tech bubble is this grand utopia where workers are given lunch, well, not during the pandemic, but you have access to all sorts of incredible things. And having experienced it firsthand, it's really kind of like college for adults. That alongside the very massive displacement of people who simply cannot afford to live in the communities that they lived in before. And this is a serious issue. And the only way that I can think to reconcile some of these tensions is to have people from the community at the table when these decisions are being made. And part of this is back to the question of representation, just having people who understand what it feels like to come from a community that is not as well off is very important. But in the absence of that, there certainly need to be conversations with communities that we're moving into. For example, there are several different cities wherein tech companies are developing housing. This does not serve the community whatsoever. I think there needs to be a relationship between tech companies and communities wherein, since tech is extracting so many resources from communities, they should be providing some sort of resource back, and not just in ideological market power for the community, but something more tangible. And this definitely needs to be discussed with the community in order to come up with what exactly that is.
Just really quickly, I think that, I mean, I absolutely agree that tech companies should not be allowed to do just whatever they want. I mean, yes, they're big and powerful, but, this is really not fair that they should be, allowed to sort of come into communities, displace people, engage in gentrification with no repercussions. And so I think this is where the role for government comes in, in terms of saying, look, if you're going to come in here and do all this stuff, then here's what you need to give back, right? So I think that the citizens' concerns should be mediated through government. The best way to do that, probably, at least in this example, is through local government, where people have the most voice as compared to national government. And saying, look, there is an understanding that what has been done in terms of physical displacement has been incredibly destructive and problematic for the people that were sort of there before, and that the people that are sort of the newcomers have been insulated from that. So first of all, that needs to end. Secondly, here are some things that we would like. We're not necessarily objecting to folks coming in, but you need to come in the right way. And here's what folks, what the community want. And here is what we are demanding if we're going to let you into our communities. And so I think that is how that's going to, or that should move through government in terms of it being a negotiation with these large tech companies. And that's what I'd like to see going forward.
Okay, well, if there are no further questions, it looks like we're running right up against our time. Megan just dropped a link in the chat section. It's a short little survey on your experiences and your thoughts. I would love to thank our panelists, Dr. Phelan and Sierra. This was really informative. I learned a lot just hearing your insights. And I would also really like to thank our moderators from the Juris Digital Scholars Program. You all did a really excellent job. And to our audience, thank you so much for bearing with the technical difficulties and joining us this evening. And if anyone, panelists or moderators, if you have anything else to add other than that, I think we're right up against our time.